Today's topic is unintended consequences. Often, when a major historical decision is made, the consequences of that decision are not what were intended by the people who made it. In the case of nuclear weapons, the motivation for nuclear weapons was to achieve superior firepower, with the direct aim of ending the Second World War in the Pacific, and if necessary also they would have been employed in Europe. The unanticipated and unintended consequence was 70 years of peace. Now, you might think it's a little strange for me to speak of the current time as a peaceful one. Take a look at this graph. This graph is an example of quantitative history. It shows the number of people killed in war year by year. It shows all of the 20th century and the very beginning of the 21st. And you can see that the first half of the 20th century was awful. The First World War killed 19 million people, and the Second World War killed 50 million people. That's not even counting wounded or homeless or properties destroyed. That's just people dead. The kill rate during the Second World War was 1,000 people per hour, 24 hours a day, every day for 6 years. If you compare that with the wars that are going on today, you see that the present wars are insignificant on this scale. Now, I mean no insult to the veterans of the more recent wars. Obviously, if you're in combat, then war is the worst thing that can possibly happen. The thing is, many fewer people are in combat. Many fewer people are being killed in combat. And many fewer innocent bystanders are also being involved in the combat. If we look at this longer view, we can see that the present time is the most peaceful time in the last 600 years. Now, how do we get the impression from the daily news that the world is engulfed in wars? Well, it's a simple thing, really. One of the ways for a young journalist to make his or her name is to be a war reporter, because people like to watch news of wars. Sponsors like to sponsor news broadcasts containing news of wars. And so there is a tremendous premium placed on bad news, and the worse the better, from the standpoint of the news business. There's also a less ominous side to this, in that the reporters who place themselves in harm's way meet a lot of people to whom they feel a debt. They feel that it's up to them to tell these people's story so that it will motivate other people to come to their aid. And as a result, we are inundated with news stories about war, when this graph shows that war is not a commonplace thing anymore. And why isn't it? It's because nearly every leader on earth understands that you can't start a nuclear war and come away with any kind of positive outcome. nuclear war can only lead to disaster for both sides. The level of death and destruction and the kinds of death and destruction turn all the participants into a nuclear war into pariahs. Now you might say, well, we wouldn't be using nuclear weapons anyway. But in fact, that's not the truth. If we look at the history of wars since World War II, the first one, the Korean War, was initially commanded by the hero of the war against the Japanese, General Douglas MacArthur. And General Douglas MacArthur's brilliant plan to win the Korean War was to drop 30 to 50 atomic bombs on targets in China, and then to cede the border between China and North Korea with radioactive cobalt-60 to provide anyone from crossing that area for a century. This was the quality of military thinking, and it was only the caution of the political leaders that prevented this from happening to us. And then in the Vietnam War, the Joint Chiefs of Staff recommended to the presidents involved that they drop nuclear weapons on Vietnam, both North and South Vietnam. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed, and the man who gets the blame for extending the Vietnam War, Lyndon Johnson, had the good sense not to use nuclear weapons in that war. Basically, one could even say that the scientists who spied for the Soviet Union in order to give the secrets of nuclear weapons to both sides of a coming global conflict between communism and capitalism were correct, because it was the balance between the nuclear armaments of the Soviet Union and the United States and its allies that prevented anyone from feeling confidence that they could use nuclear weapons and come out on top. It was the stalemate that kept the peace. Now, stalemates are dangerous because there could always be an error. There could always be an overzealous local commander who wants to take it upon himself to drop nuclear weapons. In fact, there was a Russian commander in Cuba at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis who had control of nuclear weapons that could have struck Washington, D.C. Fortunately, he wasn't foolish enough to use them, but he had the ability to use them. Similarly, there was a Russian submarine commander who had nuclear-tipped torpedoes on his submarine, and again, he had the sense not to use them. So, there are dangers. The world has been through a dangerous time, and we're not through yet. We now have another enemy with thermonuclear weapons in the state of North Korea. And we are presently ruled by a president who doesn't appear to understand why we don't use nuclear weapons. In fact, he has asked his military leadership to give him more options, more different kinds of nuclear weapons, indicating that he really doesn't understand what would happen if we started a war using nuclear weapons. I can't imagine anything that would make the Russians happier than to have the North Koreans and us go after each other with nuclear weapons while the Russians sit back and tell the whole world, you see, you can't trust those Americans. They're the only ones who've ever used nuclear weapons. We should be in charge.